The Nebraska wind was a constant thief. It stole the warmth from your skin, the moisture from your lips, and the words from your mouth before they could fully form. It was a wind that smelled of dust and distance, of dry golden grass that stretched to a horizon so flat and vast it seemed to mock the very notion of a destination. For Evelyn Whitmore, arriving in the year 1878, it smelled of gunpowder and horse leather, the twin perfumes of her father's world. The wagon groaned to a halt, its wheels finally silenced after weeks of rhythmic complaint. Evelyn pushed back the canvas flap and squinted against the fierce afternoon sun before them. The camp of the United States Army was a place of rigid lines and predictable order. Tents stood in neat rows, a canvas geometry imposed upon the wild land. Men in blue uniforms moved with purpose, their voices sharp and their movements efficient. It was a world she understood, a world of rules and regulations written down on paper. Beyond it, perhaps a half-mile distant, was another world entirely. The Lakota camp was a place of circles. Tippies of hide reached for the sky like pale, patient fingers, their arrangement following a logic Evelyn could not yet perceive. Smoke curled from their peaks in lazy spirals, carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, a smell that was somehow more ancient than the dust itself. It was a settlement that did not fight the landscape but seemed to grow from it, as natural as the cottonwood trees clustered by the creek. The space between the two camps felt like a century of misunderstanding, a gulf of silence and suspicion that the wind did little to bridge. Her father, Colonel Richard Whitmore, dismounted from his horse. He was a man carved from the same hard material as his beliefs. His face was a map of discipline, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and he believed fervently that civilization was not a request but a command, best delivered with the unwavering authority of guns and signed paper. He adjusted his uniform, a gesture of settling not into the place, but into his role within it. He looked at Evelyn, his expression devoid of paternal warmth, replaced by a professional expectation. "Come, Evelyn," he said, his voice clipped. "We must prepare. Your duties begin now." Her duty was to be a ghost, a silent hand transcribing the words that would shape the future of this land and its people. She was her father's instrument, her fine Eastern education and steady penmanship the tools he would use to record the treaty. She had been taught that history was written by men like him, and her role was simply to ensure the ink was clear and the letters perfectly formed. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, a garment of dark wool utterly unsuited to the prairie heat, and followed him toward the large tent that had been erected for the negotiations. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Army officers stood on one side, their polished boots planted firmly, their faces set with a grim determination. On the other side sat a council of Lakota elders and leaders. They sat with a stillness that felt more powerful than any military posture. Their faces, weathered by sun and wind, were studies in dignity. They did not look at the soldiers. They looked at the empty space in the middle of the tent, as if the real conversation was happening there, in the silence. Evelyn took her seat at a small wooden table set to one side, her purpose clear. She was not a participant. She was a recording device. She uncapped her inkwell, tested the nib of her pen on a scrap of paper, and waited. Her father took his place at the head of the Army delegation, laying a leather portfolio on the table before him. The rustle of his papers was the only sound. Then the flap of the tent was pushed aside, and he entered. He was taller than the others, his presence filling the tent in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. He moved with a liquid grace, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. He wore simple buckskin, adorned with quill work that told a story she could not read. His hair was long and black, bound by a simple leather band, but it was his face that commanded the space. It was a face of sharp angles and profound calm, and his eyes held the deep, knowing stillness of the prairie itself. This was Chief Black Eagle. He did not look at the soldiers or at her father. His gaze swept over the gathering before settling on the elders of his council, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The negotiations began. A slow, ponderous exchange filtered through an interpreter, a man named Samuel Crow who stood uneasily between the two worlds. Colonel Whitmore spoke of lines on maps, of government annuities, of the inevitable march of progress. His words were precise, legalistic, and as unyielding as iron. When he finished, a hush fell. Chief Black Eagle rose to speak. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the enclosed space, a low rumble like distant thunder. He spoke in the flowing cadence of the Lakota language. Evelyn could not understand the words, but she could understand their weight. He spoke of the earth not as property to be divided, but as a mother to be honored. He spoke of buffalo and ancestors, of sacred promises that could not be broken. His hands moved as he spoke, not with wild gestures, but with a deliberate eloquence that seemed to sketch his meaning in the air. As he spoke, his eyes moved across the room, assessing each of the uniformed men, then, for a fleeting moment, his gaze met hers. It was not a glance or a casual look. It was a direct and unnerving connection, as if he were looking past her spectacles, past her carefully composed expression, and into the very heart of her. In his eyes, she saw not the savage her father's world described, but a deep, unplumbable intelligence, a profound sorrow, and a strength that seemed drawn from the very land they stood upon. She looked at him, and for a heartbeat the prairie stopped breathing. The tent, the soldiers, her father's rigid posture, all of it faded into an indistinct blur. There was only the silent communication passing between her, the dutiful daughter of the East, and him, the leader of a people facing erasure. It was a look that asked a question she did not know how to answer. Then, just as quickly, his gaze moved on, and the world rushed back in. Her hand trembled slightly as she dipped her pen, the ink spotting the pristine page. She felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, a strange and unsettling awareness that she was not merely a scribe. She was a witness. Later that evening, the oppressive heat of the day gave way to a cool, star-littered night. The sounds of the two camps drifted on the wind, a discordant melody of a bugle call from the army post and the steady, hypnotic rhythm of a distant drum from the Lakota tippies. Evelyn lay on her cot, unable to sleep. The face of Black Eagle was imprinted on the inside of her eyelids. The memory of his gaze made her feel exposed, as if he had seen the conflict already brewing inside her, a conflict she herself had not yet been willing to name. She rose and lit a lantern, the small flame pushing back the suffocating darkness of her tent. Her father was at a meeting with his senior officers, and she had been tasked with organizing the documents in his portfolio for the next day. It was a mindless task, one she had performed countless times. She sorted through official correspondence, maps marked with proposed boundary lines, and copies of previous, broken treaties. It was the dry and dusty paperwork of conquest. Tucked at the very bottom of the portfolio, separate from the official documents, was a personal letter. It was sealed not with a government stamp, but with a simple wax seal bearing her father's family crest. It was addressed to a senator back in Washington, a man whose name she recognized as a powerful railroad investor. Curiosity, a trait her father had always tried to suppress in her, got the better of her. Her hands, acting of their own accord, broke the seal. The letter was written in her father's familiar, precise script, but the words were not those of a diplomat seeking a just peace. They were the words of a conspirator. He wrote not of treaties, but of tactics. He described the Lakota as children who needed to be managed, their stubbornness an obstacle to be overcome, not a position to be respected. He spoke of the current negotiations as a necessary formality, a public performance to placate the sentimentalists back east. The real work, he explained, was already done. Geologists, disguised as trappers, had confirmed the presence of significant gold deposits in the Black Hills, the very land that was the spiritual heart of the Lakota Nation and supposedly protected by prior agreements. The plan was simple and brutal. He would offer a treaty that seemed generous on its surface, full of promises of provisions and protection. He would use every means to secure Black Eagle's signature. Once the treaty was signed and the Lakota were pacified onto a smaller, worthless reservation, the army would secure the region, and the senators' companies would be given first access to the gold. The letter ended with a chilling sentence. "We are building a nation, my friend, and a nation must be built on a foundation of iron and gold, not on the fanciful beliefs of a dying race." Evelyn had to read the sentence 3 times before the full weight of its meaning crushed her. The air in the tent grew thin, and a cold dread washed over her. Colder than any Nebraska night. This was not a negotiation. It was a meticulously planned theft, cloaked in the language of law and progress. Her father was not a peacemaker. He was a thief in a decorated uniform. Her whole life had been built upon a foundation of faith in her father's righteousness, in the inherent goodness of their cause. She was the daughter of a man who brought order to chaos, law to the lawless. That foundation had just crumbled into dust. The man who had written this letter was a stranger to her. She folded the paper with trembling fingers, the crisp parchment a testament to the cold, calculated betrayal it contained. She placed it back in the portfolio, her movements stiff and automatic. She looked at her own ink-stained fingers, the tools of her complicity. Every word she was to transcribe, every clause and article of the coming treaty would be a lie. She was not recording history. She was helping to write a fiction, a grand and terrible one, paid for with the soul of a people. She blew out the lantern and was plunged back into darkness. But now, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the image of Chief Black Eagle's eyes. They were eyes that had seen betrayal before. They were eyes that had watched promises turn to dust. And they were eyes that had looked at her, as if asking a simple, silent question. "Which side are you on?" For the first time in her 25 years, Evelyn Whitmore did not know the answer. The drumming from the Lakota camp continued its steady, ageless beat, a pulse from the heart of the land itself, and for the first time, she felt she was truly listening. The morning sun was a bright, unforgiving judge. It poured over the prairie, bleaching the gold grass to a pale white and exposing every detail with merciless clarity. For Evelyn, who had spent the night wrestling with the shadows of her father's deceit, the light felt like an accusation. Sleep had offered no escape, only fractured dreams of ink turning to blood on a long, scrolling treaty. When she emerged from her tent, the world looked the same, but her place in it felt profoundly and irrevocably altered. She saw Samuel Crow standing near the mess tent, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He was a man who lived his life in the space between 2 languages, 2 peoples, 2 worlds. It showed in the way he stood, neither fully at ease in the military camp nor entirely separate from it. He wore the trousers and boots of a white man, but his shirt was of soft, beaded deerskin, and his long hair was braided in the Lakota style. He had a gentle, intelligent face, but his eyes held a permanent watchfulness, the look of a man forever translating his own existence for the benefit of others. He noticed her and offered a small, hesitant smile. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." "Good morning, Samuel." Her voice was more brittle than she intended. She had always felt a quiet sympathy for him, for the difficult path he walked. Now, after reading her father's letter, her sympathy was tainted with a new and unwelcome suspicion. Was he a bridge between worlds, or was he a tool, another instrument to be used and discarded in her father's grand design? He seemed to sense her unease. He looked down at his cup. "The air is heavy today." He said it as a simple observation, but Evelyn heard a deeper meaning. "It feels like a storm is gathering, even without clouds." Evelyn thought of the letter, a storm of paper and ink locked away in her father's portfolio. "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." She watched him for a moment longer, this man who understood the words of both sides. She wondered if he also understood their truths. The second day of negotiations convened under the same suffocating tension as the first, only now, for Evelyn, The tension had a name. It was the weight of a known lie. She took her seat, her hands arranging her paper and ink with an outward calm that felt like a performance. She avoided her father's gaze, focusing instead on the Lakota Council. Their stillness seemed different to her today, less a sign of stoicism and more like the deep, patient waiting of the earth itself, which endures all seasons, knowing that lies, like winter frost, cannot last forever. Chief Black Eagle entered and took his place. He gave no sign of having noticed her disruptive stare from the day before. His face was a mask of impassive dignity. Yet, as he settled himself, his eyes briefly flicked toward her station, a look so fleeting she might have imagined it. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of her presence. Nothing more, but it sent a strange flutter through her chest. Colonel Whitmore began the proceedings. He unrolled a large map, pinning it to a standing board. The map was a stark piece of cartography, all sharp lines and bold print, a brutal geometry forced upon a landscape of curves and whispers. With a wooden pointer, he began to outline the government's proposal. His voice was smooth and reasonable, the voice of a benevolent patriarch guiding his wayward children. He spoke of a new, permanent home for the Lakota people, a generous parcel of land where they would be protected. Protected, Evelyn thought, the word now tasting like ash in her mouth. He spoke of government rations of beef and flour, of schools to educate their children in the ways of the modern world, of doctors to tend their sick. He painted a picture of a secure and prosperous future, a future purchased at the low price of surrendering the Black Hills and a few other inconveniently resource-rich territories. He never mentioned gold. He spoke only of peace, of a final end to all conflict. It was a masterful speech, each word a carefully polished stone in a wall of deception. When he finished, he sat back, a look of magnanimous expectation on his face. The tent was silent. The army officers nodded in approval. The Lakota elders remained motionless, their expressions unreadable. All eyes turned to Black Eagle. He rose slowly, the fringe on his buckskin shirt swaying with the movement. He did not look at the map. He looked at Colonel Whitmore. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, the Lakota words flowing like a deep river. Evelyn, pen poised, found herself listening not just with her ears but with her entire being, trying to absorb the meaning through the cadence and the tone. She could not follow the language, but she could feel the power of his conviction. He spoke for a long time, his words weaving a narrative that felt far older and more profound than any line on her father's map. She saw the other Lakota men nod, their faces reflecting a shared and sacred understanding. His speech was not a plea. It was a declaration of unassailable truth. Finally, he fell silent and sat down. The weight of his words remained in the air. Colonel Whitmore turned to Samuel Crow, a slight, impatient arch to his eyebrow. "Well, Mr. Crow, what is the chief's answer?" Samuel swallowed, his own internal conflict suddenly visible on his face. He glanced nervously from the colonel to Black Eagle and back again. He cleared his throat. "Chief Black Eagle," he began, his voice thin. "He says that he has heard your words. He understands the generosity of the Great Father in Washington. He says that his people are weary of fighting. He asks for some time to consider the placement of the boundaries you have drawn. He wishes to ensure his people are given good water and grazing land." Evelyn's pen froze halfway to the inkwell. A wave of disbelief washed over her. It was not possible. The feeling, the force, the sheer, unbending dignity of Black Eagle's speech could not possibly be reduced to such a timid, compliant request. Samuel had taken a pillar of granite and chiseled it down to a handful of gravel. He had taken the roar of a lion and turned it into the bleat of a lamb. He had not translated, he had surrendered. She looked at her father. A small, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. He had expected this. He had counted on it. He was seeing a man not as he was, but as he wished him to be compliant, simple, and easily managed. And then Evelyn looked at Black Eagle. His face remained impassive, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, were fixed on Samuel Crow with an expression of profound and weary disappointment. It was the look of a man who had heard his soul mistranslated one too many times. Something inside Evelyn snapped. It was the fine, taut thread of obedience that had bound her for her entire life. It was the belief that silence was a virtue, that her role was to observe and not to act. The injustice of the moment was so raw, so blatant. It was like a physical blow. To allow this lie to be written down, to become the official record, was to be more than a scribe. It was to be an accomplice. Before she was even aware of her own intention, she was on her feet. The scrape of her chair on the hard earth was a shockingly loud noise in the tense silence. Every head in the tent swiveled to face her. The soldiers stared, mouths agape. The Lakota elders leaned forward, their eyes wide with surprise. Her father's face was a thundercloud of pure fury. "What is the meaning of this? Evelyn," he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She barely heard him. Her gaze was locked with Black Eagle's. She drew a breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That is not what he said. She said," her voice clearer and stronger than she ever thought it could be. Samuel Crow looked as if he had been struck. "Miss Whitmore, please." She ignored him, her attention fixed on the chief. She did not have the words to translate his speech perfectly, but she had understood its spirit. She had felt its truth. He did not speak of boundaries and grazing land. She continued, looking directly at her father. "He spoke of the earth as his mother, and he said that a man cannot sell his mother. He said that the promises of your government are like words written on the winter snow, gone with the spring thaw. He spoke of the spirits of his ancestors who dwell in the Black Hills, and he said that their spirits are not for sale. He said he would not trade honor for a warm belly." She faltered, her knowledge of the language exhausted, but her point was made. She had taken Samuel's gravel and returned it to granite. A deep, collective stillness descended upon the tent. It was a silence so absolute that the buzzing of a fly near the canvas wall sounded like a roar. Her father's face was white with rage, his knuckles pale where he gripped the edge of the table. He looked as if he wanted to strike her. But it was Black Eagle's reaction that held her. He had not moved. He simply watched her, and the impassive mask had fallen away. For the second time, she found herself caught in his gaze, but this time it was different. It was not a fleeting question. It was a look of profound, startling recognition. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, not as the colonel's daughter, not as a piece of the white world that had come to cheat him, but as someone who had chosen to speak a difficult truth. And in that long, silent gaze, something passed between them. It was a promise, forged in a moment of shared defiance. It was an understanding that transcended language and culture. It was the beginning of a dangerous and unspoken alliance. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not for her father to see. It was only for her. Then the mask of the stoic chief returned, but the silent message had been delivered. The truth had been spoken, and the world had shifted on its axis. The silence that followed Evelyn's outburst in the negotiation tent was a living thing. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all other sound, pressing down on her with the weight of her own defiance. Her father had not spoken to her since. He had simply given her a look of such cold, contained fury that it had felt like a physical blow, a promise of a reckoning to come. She had been dismissed, not with words, but with a contemptuous flick of his eyes, and had returned to her small tent, a pariah in the world she had always known. Now, night had fallen again, but it offered no comfort. Sleep was a distant country to which she had lost her passport. She lay on her cot, listening to the alien sounds of the prairie. From the army camp came the predictable noises of order and discipline, the lonely call of a sentry, the metallic clang of a dropped cookpot, the low murmur of men playing cards. It was a world of straight lines and sharp corners, a world that suddenly felt like a cage. But from the Lakota camp, carried on the ceaseless wind. Came the sound of a drum. It was not a sound of war, not the frantic, aggressive beat she had read about in sensational Eastern papers. This was something else entirely. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, as constant and as natural as a human heartbeat. It was the rhythm of the land itself, a sound that spoke of endurance, of community, of a life lived in circles, not lines. The sound seemed to pull at something deep inside her, a restless chord she did not know she possessed. The air in the tent was stale with the scent of canvas and her own quiet desperation. She could not breathe. She needed the sky, the vast, open, and indifferent sky. Pushing aside the tent flap, she slipped out into the cool darkness. The moon was a sliver of bone white hanging in a sea of ink-dark sky, and the stars were scattered like chips of ice, impossibly bright and distant. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool a poor defense against the chill that came not from the air, but from her own profound isolation. She walked away from the rigid rows of tents, her feet finding the soft, dusty path that led toward the creek, the natural boundary between the two camps. The drumming grew stronger as she walked, no longer a distant whisper, but a living presence in the night. It drew her onward, a siren song of a world she had only glimpsed but could not forget. The creek whispered over smooth stones, its voice a gentle counterpoint to the steady beat of the drum. She stopped at the water's edge, where the moonlight silvered the surface of the stream, and then she saw him. He was standing on the opposite bank, partially hidden in the shadows of a large cottonwood tree. It was Chief Black Eagle. He was looking not at the army camp or toward his own people, but down into the moving water, as if reading a story only he could see. He stood with that same profound stillness she had seen in the tent, a stillness that seemed to absorb the sounds of the night and make them part of his own silence. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She should turn back. To be seen here, alone, near the Lakota camp, would be an unforgivable transgression. Her father's anger would be nothing compared to the scandal it would cause, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. She was held captive by the quiet dignity of the scene, by the unexpected peace she felt just being near it. He must have heard her, or perhaps he sensed her presence in the way a wild creature senses a change in the wind. He lifted his head slowly and looked directly at her across the narrow ribbon of water. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet, questioning calm. The moonlight caught the high planes of his face, making it seem as if it were carved from ancient stone. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two silent figures on opposite banks of a stream, caught in a tableau of moonlight and shadow. The drum continued its steady beat, the pulse of the world. Evelyn felt she should say something, offer an explanation for her presence, but no words came. He spoke first. His voice was low, and it carried easily across the water, a sound as natural as the rustle of leaves. He used her language, the words careful and deliberate, as if he were taking each one from a pouch and examining it before offering it. "You walk like the land does not know your name yet," he said. The observation was so unexpected, so deeply perceptive, that it disarmed her completely. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. She was a ghost here, a transient presence leaving no mark. She looked down at her own leather boots, so out of place on this wild earth. "Maybe I am trying to earn it," she answered, her own voice a surprising whisper in the vastness of the night. The words were truer than anything she had said in weeks. He considered her answer, his head tilted slightly. He took a few steps along his side of the bank, his movements fluid and silent. "The land does not give its name easily," he said. "It must be listened to. Your people are not good listeners. They only know how to speak." Evelyn thought of her father, of his booming speeches and his unshakable certainties. She thought of the endless documents and treaties, the torrent of words meant to command and control, not to understand. She felt a flush of shame. He is right, she thought. "We have learned some of your words," he continued, his gaze still fixed on her. "To hear the lies you tell more clearly." It was a hard statement, But his tone was without bitterness. It was the simple, weary truth. "And did you learn enough to know that the words I spoke today were true?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The moonlight fell upon his face, and she saw the deep lines etched there, lines of sorrow and responsibility. "I heard the truth under your words," he said. "The truth does not always need a perfect translation. A heart that is listening can hear it." They fell silent again. But the silence was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a fragile, burgeoning understanding. Evelyn felt an inexplicable urge to cross the stream, to close the physical distance that separated them, but she remained where she was. He spoke of his people, not of their battles or their grievances, but of their connection to the world. He told her how the birth of a child was celebrated as a gift from the earth, and how the passing of an elder was a returning of that gift. He spoke of the buffalo as a brother who gave his own body so the people could live. He spoke of loss, of the faces of friends and family he would never see again, of sacred places that were now just names on her father's map. As he spoke, Evelyn felt the carefully constructed walls of her own world begin to dissolve. She had been taught to see this land as a wilderness to be tamed, a resource to be exploited. She had been taught to see his people as obstacles to progress, as a dying race whose beliefs were the fanciful notions of children. But the man before her spoke with the wisdom of ages, with a connection to the world so profound it made her own life seem shallow and rootless. She thought of her own mother, lost to a fever back in Boston, a memory that was now a faint, watercolor image. She, too, understood loss. "My people fight to be seen," he said at last, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was almost carried away by the wind. "Your father and his soldiers. They look at us, but they do not see us. They see savages. They see pests to be cleared from the land. They do not see our children's faces, or hear our women laugh. They do not see the souls of our warriors. We have become invisible in our own home." The raw pain in his voice was a physical thing, a shard of ice in her heart. She saw with a sudden, terrible clarity the depth of the injustice, an injustice far greater than a single, deceitful treaty. It was the erasure of an entire people's humanity. All her fear, all her confusion, seemed to coalesce into a single, powerful emotion of fierce and overwhelming empathy. She took a step closer to the edge of the creek, her shawl falling unheeded to the ground. Her gaze met his across the shimmering water, and she poured all of her newfound conviction into her words. "Then look at me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering in the night air. "I see you." The drumming from the camp stopped. In that exact moment, all sound seemed to cease. There was only the moon, the whispering water, and the profound, echoing silence between them. He did not move, did not speak. He simply looked at her, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she could not name. It was not surprise. It was not gratitude. It was something more elemental, a soul recognizing another in the vast, lonely darkness. The seed of a story that had no title, no words yet written, had just been planted in the silent, moonlit soil of the Nebraska prairie. The days that followed were a study in the art of silence. Colonel Whitmore did not rage. He did not lecture. He did not punish. He simply erased Evelyn from his world. At the mess table, he spoke to the officer beside her as if her chair were empty. During the farcical continuation of the negotiations, his eyes passed over her without a flicker of recognition. It was a cold, precise, and suffocating disapproval. And it was far more terrifying than any shouting match. The army camp, once a place of familiar order, had become a prison of invisible walls. The soldiers, sensing the colonel's displeasure, treated her with a wary, formal distance. Even Samuel Crow seemed to avoid her, his eyes full of a troubled mixture of admiration and fear. Evelyn performed her duties with numb precision, her pen scratching across the page, recording words she now knew to be hollow. The official treaty was a labyrinth of legal jargon, designed to confuse and ensnare. It was a weapon made of paper, and in her father's locked portfolio lay the letter, the map to the true heart of the betrayal. The knowledge of it burned in her mind, a secret so heavy she felt it might crush her. The need to warn Black Eagle became not a choice, but a compulsion. It was a moral imperative that was stronger than her fear of her father, stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. She had told him she could see him, and to see and do nothing was a betrayal of a different, more personal kind. 2 nights after their first clandestine meeting, she risked it again. She waited until the camp was deep in the sleep of the exhausted, until the moon had risen high enough to cast long, deceptive shadows. Slipping from her tent was like stepping off a cliff into a dark sea. Every rustle of the grass, every distant cry of a coyote, sent a jolt of panic through her. She moved with a stealth she did not know she possessed, a ghost in her own father's camp, making her way back to the Whispering Creek. He was there. He was not waiting in the open, but stood back in the deeper shadows of the cottonwoods, a figure of patient stillness. He stepped forward as she approached, and the relief that flooded her was so potent it almost buckled her knees. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that blended with the sounds of the night. "It is not safe for you." "I had to," she said, her breath coming in short, nervous puffs. "There is more you need to know. The treaty they offer you, it is a lie." He nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I know it is a lie. I do not need your words to tell me that. I can feel the lie in the air when your father speaks, but I do not know the shape of the lie." This was the task she had set for herself, the most dangerous translation of all. She had brought a copy of the treaty proposal with her, the paper tucked into the bodice of her dress, by the faint light of the moon. She knelt on the damp earth of the creek bank and spread the document out. She began to explain it, not as a lawyer would, but as a storyteller. She pointed to the complex phrases and impenetrable clauses. "This part," she said, her finger tracing a line of script. "It says the government will give you food, but it does not say for how long. It does not say what happens when the food stops. This line here, it speaks of a reservation boundary, but the map my father uses is not a true map. It is a map of his own making, drawn to keep you from the best water and the last of the good hunting grounds." He listened without interruption, his focus absolute. He knelt beside her, his presence a strange comfort in the darkness. She could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke and sweetgrass that clung to his clothes. Then she took a deep breath and told him the worst of it. She told him about her father's letter, about the geologists disguised as trappers, about the senator and the railroad. She told him about the gold. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and heavy. He did not react with anger, as she had expected. A deep, profound sadness settled over his features. He looked away from her, out toward the dark, rolling hills that hid their sacred treasures. "The yellow metal," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It drives your people mad. They would tear up their own mother's bones to find it. Now I understand the hunger in your father's eyes. It is not the hunger for peace. It is the fever for this dust." In that moment, she was no longer Colonel Whitmore's daughter. She was a co-conspirator, a traitor to her blood and her nation, bound to this man by the shared weight of a terrible secret. They began to meet there, in the secret heart of the night. Whenever it was safe, the creek became their classroom, their sanctuary. It was a place where the rules of their two worlds seemed to fade away, leaving only the truth of the earth beneath them and the sky above. Their meetings became a quiet exchange, a bartering of knowledge that was more precious than any treaty. He taught her how to listen to the land. He showed her how a bent twig could tell the story of a passing deer, how the call of a specific bird could signal a change in the weather. He made her close her eyes and just listen, to separate the sound of the wind in the grass from the wind in the trees, to hear the subtle language of the night. You must hear the world before you can see it. He told her, your people only look, they do not see because they have never learned to listen. In return, she taught him the building blocks of her own world's weapon, the written word. She brought scraps of paper and a piece of charcoal. And in the soft dirt of the bank, she drew the letters of the alphabet. "This is A," she would say, tracing the shape. "It is the first sound in the word army. This is T for treaty." She taught him to form his name, Black Eagle, in the strange, angular script of his enemies. He was a quick and serious student. His brow furrowed in concentration as he mimicked the shapes, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they guided the charcoal. He seemed to understand that these symbols held a power, a magic he needed to comprehend in order to fight it. The danger of their meetings was a constant, sharp-edged presence. One night, the sound of a patrol on the far side of the army camp sent them both diving for the deep shadows, their hearts pounding in a shared rhythm of fear. They huddled together behind a thicket of willows, so close she could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, until the sound of the horses faded into the distance. The shared peril forged a bond between them that was stronger than words, an intimacy born of risk. Her father's scrutiny intensified. He would ask her casual, probing questions about her sleeplessness, about the smudges of dirt she sometimes missed on the hem of her dress. "You seem distracted." "Evelyn," he said one evening, his eyes like chips of ice, "I hope you are not allowing the rustic nature of this place to cloud your judgment." It was a warning, as clear as any verbal threat. One night, as a full moon bathed the prairie in a soft, ethereal light, the lessons fell away. They sat in comfortable silence by the water's edge, the treaty and the alphabet forgotten. The air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the gurgle of the creek and their own quiet breathing. Evelyn found herself studying his face in the moonlight. She saw not just the stoic chief or the proud warrior, but the man. She saw the weariness in the lines around his eyes, the immense burden of leadership he carried, the deep well of sorrow for all he had lost. He was not an idea, not a symbol of a noble, vanishing people. He was a human being, with a history and a heart that was as complex and as real as her own. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned to look at her. The question in his eyes was no longer about treaties or words. It was something far more personal, something that made her breath catch in her chest. The space between them, which had been filled with lessons and warnings, was now charged with a different kind of tension, a quiet, humming energy. Slowly, as if testing the air for a trap, he lifted his hand. She did not flinch, did not pull away. She watched, mesmerized, as his fingers, warm and rough from a life lived under the sun and sky, came to rest against her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the strength she knew he possessed. It was a touch of reverence, of questioning, of simple, profound contact. A tremor went through her, a current of heat that spread from that single point of contact to every corner of her being. His eyes held hers, and his voice was a low, rough whisper, like the sound of stones moving at the bottom of a river. "Look at me when I touch you." It was a command, but it was also a plea to be present, to be honest, to meet this moment without artifice or fear. It was the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her. She held his gaze. She looked, and she saw everything. She saw the warrior, the leader, the teacher, the man. She saw his strength, and in the slight trembling of his thumb against her skin, she saw his vulnerability. She saw the pain of his past and the uncertainty of his future. She saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own yearning for a truth she could hold on to. She saw not an enemy, not a savage, not the other. She saw a soul, the fire that had been a spark of rebellion, then a flicker of empathy, now ignited into a flame, a warm and terrifying blaze in the center of her chest. This, she realized with a clarity that was both beautiful and devastating, was the beginning of love. The tender moment by the creek felt like a dream from a different life, a fragile memory preserved in moonlight. The reality of the following days was a harsh, sun-baked return to a world of iron and paper, The flame that had been kindled in Evelyn's heart now had to be hidden away, a secret ember glowing in the cold, public space of her father's command. The negotiations, if they could still be called that, had reached an impasse. The pretense of discussion had evaporated, leaving only the brittle skeleton of a demand. The change came on a blisteringly hot afternoon. The air was so still and heavy, it felt like a wool blanket soaked in water. Colonel Whitmore convened a final meeting in the negotiation tent. His mood was as thunderous and oppressive as the sky. He did not sit. He stood before the Lakota Council, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture the very definition of unyielding military authority. His patience, he announced to the sweltering tent, was at an end. He unrolled the treaty document with a sharp snap that made Evelyn jump. It lay on the table like a dead thing, a pale skin covered in black, intricate scars. "Chief Black Eagle," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth or respect, "you and your council have debated and delayed long enough. The United States government has made a generous and final offer. You will accept these terms. You will affix your mark to this document before the sun rises tomorrow." Black Eagle rose to his feet, not in haste, but with a deliberate, flowing motion. He did not look at the paper on the table. His eyes were fixed on the colonel. "Your government offers us a cage with a full bowl of water," he said, his voice calm and even. "You ask us to trade the sky for a roof. We are not animals to be penned. We are a people. The land you want is the heart of our people. A man cannot live if you cut out his heart and offer him a meal in return." The colonel's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching in his cheek. "That is your final answer." "It is our only answer," Black Eagle replied. "It is the answer of our fathers, and their fathers before them." "Then consider this," the colonel said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch. "Refusal to sign will be considered an act of hostility. We are prepared to enforce the peace." He let the words hang in the thick, dead air, a promise that was also a threat. He then turned on his heel and strode out of the tent without another word, leaving the treaty on the table like an ultimatum. The rest of the day passed in a state of suspended animation. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sunrise that would bring either submission or conflict. A palpable tension settled over both camps, a nervous energy that made the soldiers grip their rifles a little tighter, and the Lakota warriors watched the horizon with hooded, vigilant eyes. Evelyn felt as if a steel band were tightening around her chest. She had seen the truth in Black Eagle's words and the lie in her father's, and she was trapped between them, a helpless witness to an inevitable collision. The spark came not from the leaders, but from the frayed nerves of ordinary men. Late in the afternoon, near the creek that had once been a place of sanctuary, a young soldier, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, was watering his horse. He was jumpy, his head filled with tales of Lakota cruelty. A few Lakota boys were downstream, skipping stones across the water. One of the stones, either by accident or by boyish mischief, skipped too far, striking the soldier's horse on the flank. The animal shied violently, pulling the reins from the soldier's grasp. The soldier, embarrassed and angry, shouted at the boys. They shouted back in their own language, their words taunting. A young Lakota warrior, the older brother of one of the boys, emerged from the brush. He was tall and proud, and he met the soldier's angry glare with one of his own. An argument of gestures and insults began, a conversation of pure hostility that needed no translation. More soldiers, hearing the commotion, came running from the camp. More warriors appeared on the opposite bank. The small, personal conflict was escalating with terrifying speed into a standoff between two armed and hostile forces. There was a shove. The young warrior pushed the soldier back from his brother. The soldier stumbled, his hand flying to the hilt of the knife on his belt. What happened next was a blur of dust and shouting. It was impossible to say who moved first, who was the aggressor and who was the defender. There was a desperate, clumsy scuffle, the glint of a blade in the afternoon sun. The soldier cried out, not in agony, but in surprise and pain, stumbling back with a long, bloody gash on his forearm. The sight of his own blood seemed to break a dam of fear and rage within him. He raised his pistol and fired a shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot was like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace. It was the signal that all the unspoken fears had come true. Colonel Whitmore arrived on horseback moments later, his face a mask of cold fury. He took in the scene at a glance, his bleeding soldier. The defiant stance of the Lakota warriors, the chaos and the fear. He did not ask for an explanation. He had his pretext. This was the incident he had been waiting for, the justification he needed to move from the pen to the sword. "This is an unprovoked attack," he roared, his voice carrying across the prairie. "This is a violation of the truce." He pointed a gloved finger not at the young warrior involved in the scuffle, but toward the Lakota camp itself, at the leader he held responsible for every action of his people. "Major," he barked at his second in command, "take a platoon, go into that camp and arrest Chief Black Eagle. He is to be held accountable for this act of war. Use any force necessary." Evelyn, who had run from her tent at the sound of the shot, stood frozen at the edge of the camp, her hand flying to her mouth. No, it could not be happening. It was an injustice so blatant, so fundamentally wrong, that her mind could barely process it. To arrest a man for a fight he had not been a part of, to punish a leader for the hot-headedness of a boy. It was not law, it was tyranny. She watched in horror as the detachment of soldiers formed up, their rifles held at the ready, their faces grim and determined as they began to march toward the Lakota camp. The time for words was over. The Age of Iron had begun. Later, huddled in the suffocating confines of her tent, Evelyn listened to the sounds of the camp preparing for battle, the rhythmic tramp of marching boots, the shouted commands of officers, the metallic click of rifle bolts. Each sound was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her old life. She felt utterly and completely alone, adrift in a sea of moral confusion. She was her father's daughter, a citizen of the nation whose flag flew proudly over this camp. But her heart, her soul, her sense of right and wrong was with the man they were about to put in chains. She took out her personal journal, a small, leather-bound book that was her only confidant in this wilderness. Her hand was trembling so much she could barely hold the pen. She needed to write it down, to try and make sense of the maelstrom in her mind, to give voice to the conflict that was tearing her apart. She uncapped the ink, the familiar scent doing nothing to soothe her. She tried to think of her father, of his belief in order, in law, in the civilizing mission that had brought them here. And then she thought of Black Eagle, of his quiet dignity, of his profound connection to the land, of the gentle way his hand had touched her cheek in the moonlight. One man spoke of law and justice while orchestrating a grand theft. The other spoke of honor and truth while his world was being stolen from under his feet. The world she came from, her entire society, would look at Black Eagle and see only an obstacle, a primitive relic of a bygone age. They would use a word to dismiss him, to strip him of his humanity, to justify their own cruelty. She dipped her pen in the ink, and the words flowed onto the page, a single, defiant truth in a world of lies. "They call him savage," she wrote, the letters dark and stark against the cream-colored paper. "But he speaks more truth than all their law books combined." The night was a black, suffocating velvet, starless and moonless. The wind had picked up, a mournful, keening sound that scraped across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of dust and a storm on the horizon. To Evelyn, it sounded like the world was grieving. Black Eagle had been taken without a fight. He had walked out of his teepee, his head held high, and had offered his wrists to the soldiers to prevent a battle that would have cost the lives of his people. He was now a prisoner, held in the fortified supplies shed at the center of the army camp, bound and guarded, awaiting a summary justice that would be anything but just. Evelyn's decision was not a thought, but a physical force, a tidal wave of conviction that rose from the depths of her soul and swept away every last remnant of fear and obedience. She could not be a witness to this. To see the truth and do nothing was to be a liar. To love a man and watch him be destroyed was to let her own soul die alongside him. Her life had been a series of straight, predictable lines. Tonight, she would draw a new line, a jagged, desperate path into an unknown future. She waited until the hour after midnight, the time when the camp was at its deepest slumber, when the guards were weary and their attention dulled by the rhythmic howl of the wind. She moved through the darkness like a wraith, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had observed the camp's routines, her mind cataloging details without even knowing why. She knew which guard was prone to dozing, which part of the perimeter was darkest. Her first stop was the deserted mess tent. Her hands, trembling but sure, found what she needed: a small, sharp paring knife and a tinderbox. Her plan was desperate and simple. It relied on chaos. On the far side of the camp, near the horse lines, was a large stack of hay bales, dry as tinder from the relentless sun, shielding the tinderbox from the wind with her own body, her fingers clumsy with haste. She struck a spark. It caught, a tiny, hungry flame. She fed it a scrap of dry canvas, and then pushed the nascent fire deep into the heart of the hay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a wisp of smoke, followed by a sudden, hungry whoosh as the fire roared to life. A brilliant orange monster clawing at the night sky. Shouts erupted instantly. Men poured from their tents, confused and alarmed. The fire was near the horses, the most valuable and vulnerable asset in the camp, the entire focus of the camp. Every soldier, every officer, turned toward the blaze. It was the distraction she needed. Under the cover of the screaming confusion, she ran, a dark shape against the flickering firelight, toward the supply shed. As she had hoped, only one guard remained, a young private torn between his duty to his prisoner and the instinct to run toward the fire. He was staring, mesmerized by the flames. She came upon him from the shadows, the knife held low. She did not know if she had the strength to use it as a weapon. She prayed she would not have to. She moved with the silence Black Eagle had taught her to listen for. She was almost upon him when he turned, his eyes widening in surprise. Before he could shout, she brought the handle of the knife down with all her strength against the side of his head. It was a clumsy, desperate blow, but it was enough. He grunted and crumpled to the ground without a sound. The shed door was barred from the outside. Her hands, slick with sweat, struggled with the heavy wooden beam. It finally gave way with a groan. Inside, the darkness was absolute. She fumbled with the tinderbox again, her hands shaking so violently she could barely strike a spark. A tiny flame illuminated the space. Black Eagle was sitting against the far wall, his wrists and ankles bound with thick rope. His face was impassive, but his eyes burned with a fierce, questioning light. He did not ask how she had come. He did not ask why. He simply watched her as she knelt and sawed at the ropes with the small, inadequate knife. The fibers were tough, and her frantic efforts seemed to do little. Time was a rubber band stretching to the breaking point. She could hear her father's voice outside, barking orders, organizing a bucket brigade. They had only moments. "Look at me," he said, his voice a low command. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "Breathe. Your fear is making your hands weak. Do not think of them. Think only of the rope." His calm was an anchor in her sea of panic. She took a ragged breath and focused, sawing at the ropes with a new, steady determination. Finally, one strand gave way, then another. The ropes binding his hands fell away. He took the knife from her and, in a few swift, powerful movements, cut the ropes at his ankles. He was free. They slipped out of the shed into a world of orange light and black shadows. The wind was a gale now, whipping the flames into a frenzy and carrying with it a new sound, the sharp, stinging bite of sand. A storm was upon them. Black Eagle grabbed her hand, his grip strong and sure. They ran, away from the fire, away from the camp, and plunged into the churning darkness of the open prairie. The pursuit began almost immediately. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, and the shouts of men carried on the howling wind. The sandstorm hit them with the force of a physical blow, a blinding, suffocating wall of grit that tore at their skin and filled their lungs. The world disappeared into a brown, chaotic roar. The storm that was their enemy was also their only ally, erasing their tracks, swallowing the light of the lanterns behind them. They ran blindly, Black Eagle leading her, his hand a constant, reassuring pressure on hers. They stumbled over unseen rocks, pushed their way through thorny brush that tore at their clothes. The ground became uneven, sloping upward. They were climbing into the rocky bluffs that bordered the plains. Behind them, they heard the sporadic crack of a rifle shot, a bullet whining past them in the screaming darkness, a testament to the blind, furious chase. Hours passed in a desperate, breathless blur. Evelyn's lungs burned. Her legs were trembling with exhaustion, and the cold had begun to seep deep into her bones. The storm showed no sign of abating. They were soaked, not by rain, but by the sheer, damp chill of the wind. Just when she felt she could not take another step, Black Eagle pulled her to a halt. He had found it by touch, by an instinct she could not comprehend, a dark fissure in a rock face, a narrow opening that promised shelter. He pushed her inside, into a darkness that was even more profound than the storm, and then followed, slumping against the rock wall beside her. They were in a small cave, a shallow hollow in the rock, barely deep enough to protect them from the main force of the wind. The sound of the storm was a deafening, continuous roar outside, but inside, there was a stillness, a pocket of relative peace in the heart of the chaos. They were shivering violently, their teeth chattering uncontrollably. The cold was a relentless enemy, and they were exhausted, their bodies drained of all strength. Huddled together in the absolute dark, they were no longer a chief and a white woman, no longer from two warring worlds. They were just two human beings, stripped of everything but their shared fear and their desperate need for warmth. Without a word, he pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her, trying to share the little warmth his body still possessed. She pressed herself against his chest, her face buried in the damp buckskin of his shirt, and for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of something other than terror. They stayed like that for a long time, their shivering slowly subsiding as their shared body heat created a tiny pocket of warmth. The intimacy of their position was born of pure survival, yet it felt more profound than any drawing-room courtship. Here, in the raw, honest darkness, there were no rules, no pretenses, no lies. He tilted her face up, his hand gentle against her jaw. She could not see him, but she could feel his breath, warm against her cold skin. He did not try to kiss her. He simply held her, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Look at me," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. The command was the same as it had been by the creek, but now it held the weight of all that had happened, of the life and death race they had just run. It was a plea to see past the storm, past the fear, to the truth that remained between them. She opened her eyes in the impenetrable darkness, as if she could see him with her heart. She was no longer the frightened, obedient daughter from the East. She was a woman who had chosen her own truth, who had burned down one world to save a man from another. She had seen the ugliness and the lies, but she had also seen the honor and the beauty. "I am," she breathed, the words a vow, a final surrender to the truth she had found in his eyes. "And I see everything now." His lips found hers then, a touch that was not about passion, but about recognition. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of profound gratitude, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of fire and fear. It was a silent acknowledgement that in this one, stolen night, in this cold, dark cave, they had found the only home they might ever know. Outside, above the ceaseless howl of the wind, they could hear the distant, frustrated pop of a rifle shot. They had this night a single, perfect moment of connection, and perhaps That was all they would ever have. The dawn that broke over the prairie was a fragile, wounded thing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly silent. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, and the air was sharp and cold, carrying the damp smell of wet earth and the lingering, acrid scent of burnt hay. Inside the small cave, Evelyn awoke slowly, the deep exhaustion in her bones a dull, heavy ache. For a moment, she was disoriented, the cold stone at her back a foreign sensation. Then the memory of the fire, the escape, and the storm rushed back in, and she was acutely aware of the man sleeping beside her, his body a warm, solid presence in the cold morning. Black Eagle was still asleep, his face in repose, looking younger. The deep lines of care and sorrow smoothed away. One of his hands rested near her waist, a touch of unconscious possession that sent a fresh wave of warmth through her. The intimacy of the night before, born of desperation and culminating in a moment of profound connection, settled over her not with shame, but with a quiet, fierce tenderness. In the heart of chaos, they had found a truth. But the light of day was a harsh reminder that the world outside their shelter had not changed. Their truth was not the world's truth. She watched him for a long time, memorizing the shape of his face in the growing light. He had risked everything, and she, in her own way, had done the same. The chasm between who she had been 2 weeks ago and who she was now was so vast it was uncrossable. The bridges to her old life had been consumed in the flames she herself had set. He stirred, his eyes opening not with a slow, drowsy waking, but with the instant, alert awareness of a man who had lived his life on the edge of danger. His gaze found hers, and for a long, silent moment, the world consisted only of the space between them. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of such genuine warmth, it made her heart ache. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice a low rumble. His smile faded, replaced by the grim mask of the leader. "They will be searching now that the storm has passed." The reality of their situation descended again, cold and sharp. They were fugitives. Every moment they lingered was a gamble. They crept to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The landscape was transformed. The prairie grasses were plastered to the earth, and the creek below was a muddy, swollen torrent. In the distance, the two camps were already stirring. The army camp was a hive of activity, soldiers moving with an angry, vengeful purpose. The Lakota camp was unnervingly still, a place of watchful waiting. "We must get you to your people," Evelyn whispered. "They will hide you. You can escape north." He shook his head, his eyes scanning the terrain with an intensity that missed nothing. "They will watch my people. To go there now is to walk into the trap. We must find another way. But first, we need to get away from these hills. They will search here first." Their descent was slow and treacherous. The ground was slick with mud, and the rocks were loose and unstable. They moved with a desperate caution, staying low, using the contours of the land for cover. They had made it to the base of the bluffs and were about to make a dash for a thick stand of cottonwoods when a movement near the Lakota camp caught their eye. A small group of children, perhaps 5 or 6 of them, had wandered out from the teepees, driven by a child's irrepressible curiosity. They were moving toward the blackened, smoking patch of ground where the hayfire had been. At the same time, a patrol of 4 soldiers on horseback emerged from the army camp, their rifles held across their saddles. They were not on a routine patrol. They were hunters, their eyes scanning the landscape, their faces hard and unforgiving. The soldiers saw the children. The children, seeing the soldiers, froze like a herd of young deer. The lead soldier raised his hand, and the patrol halted. He shouted something that the wind carried away, but his tone was aggressive, accusatory. Black Eagle beside her went rigid. A low sound, almost a growl, escaped his throat. "They are afraid," he said, his voice tight with a terrible urgency. "The soldiers are angry. A frightened man with a gun is a dangerous thing. The soldiers began to advance on the children, their pace slow and menacing. One of the children, a small girl, began to cry. Her fear was a spark in a field of dry grass. The soldiers seemed to take it as a sign of guilt, of defiance. One of them raised his rifle, not to his shoulder, but in a clear and unmistakable threat. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She understood what was happening. In the soldiers' minds, these children were not innocent. They were the enemy's children. They were potential spies, potential accomplices in the escape of a prisoner. "No," she breathed, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. "We must go. Now," Black Eagle said, his voice rough. "While they are distracted, it is our only chance." He started to pull her toward the trees, but he stopped. His body was tense, his gaze fixed on the unfolding tragedy. He was a leader, a chief. His first, deepest instinct was to protect his people, especially the most helpless among them. To save himself while the children of his tribe were in danger was a betrayal of everything he was. She could feel the war raging inside him, the battle between survival and duty. He looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a profound apology. "I cannot," he said simply. He released her hand. Before she could protest, before she could even form a word, he stood up. He stepped out from behind the rock that had been concealing them, into the full, open view of the soldiers. He did not shout. He simply made himself visible. A single, defiant figure standing between the armed men and the terrified children. The soldiers' attention snapped to him instantly. A collective shout of surprise went up. The children were forgotten. The real prize was here. Black Eagle did not run. He stood his ground, drawing their full attention, giving the children the precious seconds they needed to scramble back to the safety of their camp. He looked at Evelyn one last time, a look of silent, heartbreaking finality. Then he turned to face the soldiers as they spurred their horses forward, their rifles now aimed directly at his heart. They did not shoot him. Her father wanted him alive. Evelyn could only watch, a silent scream tearing at her throat, as they surrounded him, disarmed him of the knife she had given him, and bound his hands once more. He did not struggle. He met their hatred with a dignity so profound it seemed to enrage them further, as they led him away, back toward the camp and the mockery of justice that awaited him. Her world, which had seemed so full of a terrifying new possibility just moments before, collapsed into a black hole of despair. She was found less than an hour later, huddled and shivering behind the rocks, a soldier nearly stumbling over her. The return to her father's camp was a walk of shame, the eyes of every soldier upon her, a mixture of scorn, pity, and raw hatred. She was a traitor. She had sided with the enemy. She had betrayed her own kind. She was taken directly to her father's tent. He was waiting for her. He was standing behind his campaign desk, and the look on his face was one she had never seen before. The cold, controlled anger was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, a deep, profound, and absolute disappointment. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a creature he had somehow spawned but did not recognize. He waited until the guards had left, closing the tent flap behind them. The silence in the tent was a suffocating pressure. "Did you do it for him?" he asked at last, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or did you do it to spite me?" She lifted her chin, the numbness of her grief giving way to a strange, cold clarity. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." "The right thing," he repeated, a short, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You set fire to a United States Army encampment. You assaulted a guard. You freed a prisoner charged with sedition and inciting violence. And you call that the right thing. Your sense of right and wrong appears to have been corrupted." "My sense of right and wrong has never been clearer," she said, her voice steady. "I saw the truth. I could not pretend I was blind." He slammed his hand down on the desk, the sudden violence making her flinch. "The truth," he spat. "You know nothing of the truth. The truth is that we are building a nation here. A great nation. And building requires sacrifice. It requires us to be hard. It requires us to make difficult decisions for the greater good. You, with your sentimental, childish notions, you have jeopardized everything. Did you tell him about the gold? Yes. His face went pale. You fool, he whispered, the words filled with venom. You absolute fool. You have armed him, not with a gun, but with a grievance. You have turned a simple pacification into a political disaster. He armed himself, she replied, with honor, with dignity, with a love for his people that you cannot possibly comprehend because you see them only as obstacles. He stared at her, his mind clearly struggling to find a reason, any reason, for her betrayal that he could understand. This savage, he has bewitched you. He has filled your head with his primitive fantasies. What did he promise you? She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. He promised me nothing. He offered me nothing but the truth. Her father came around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close she could see the tiny, broken veins in his eyes. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. This is not you. Evelyn, this is some madness. I will have the doctor examine you. You are not well. He is trying to get you to confess, to admit to a temporary insanity, to give him a way to save face, a way to put her back in the box of the dutiful, obedient daughter. She looked at his hand on her arm, and then up into his cold, uncomprehending eyes. She felt a profound and weary sadness for him, for his blindness. He would never see. He could never understand. He lived in a world of surfaces, of power and possessions. He had never once, in all her life, truly looked at her soul. She pulled her arm from his grasp. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry. It was quiet, filled with a certainty as solid and as ancient as the rocks in which she had hidden. He touched my soul before he ever touched my skin, she said, and that is what you will never understand. The finality in her voice, the unbridgeable gulf that had just opened between them, seemed to finally break through his anger, leaving him looking hollowed out and old. He stared at her as if she had just confessed to a murder. In a way, she had. She had murdered the daughter he thought he knew. He turned away from her, his shoulders slumping. You are confined to your tent, he said, his voice a dead monotone. A guard will be posted outside at all times. You will speak to no one. We will return to Fort Laramie in 2 days, where your fate and his will be decided. She turned and walked out of the tent, leaving him alone with the ruins of his authority, as the guard took up his position outside her tent, effectively making her a prisoner. She did not feel defeated. She felt a strange, sorrowful peace. There was no going back. She had betrayed her blood, her family, her nation, but she had been true to herself, and in a world built on lies, that felt like the only victory that mattered. The journey to Fort Laramie was a silent, grim procession. Evelyn rode in a supply wagon, a prisoner under the open sky, guarded by men who refused to meet her eyes. She was a ghost to them, a non-person, the colonel's daughter who had ceased to exist. Black Eagle rode on horseback, his hands bound before him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not look at her. He knew, as she did, that any glance between them would be twisted into further proof of their conspiracy. He looked instead at the horizon, at the endless sweep of the land he was being torn from, his gaze that of a man saying a long, slow farewell. The fort was a place of imposing order, its high wooden walls a stark declaration of power in the vast, open wilderness. It was a world of straight lines, bugle calls, and the absolute authority of the United States Army. And it was here, not in a proper courthouse, but under the harsh, unforgiving Wyoming sky, that the verdict which had been decided long ago would be formally announced. The military tribunal was a hastily constructed affair, a wooden platform set up in the center of the parade ground. 3 high-ranking officers, all of them colleagues and friends of her father, sat at a long table, their faces grim and impatient. It was not a court of law. It was a stage for a foregone conclusion. The entire garrison was assembled to watch. a sea of blue uniforms forming a rigid square around the platform. A small, silent group of Lakota, who had followed the procession from the camp, were permitted to watch from a distance, their presence a silent, sorrowful testament to the injustice unfolding. Black Eagle was led to the center of the platform. The chains on his wrists and ankles clanked with a heavy, final sound. He stood tall and straight, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers not with fear or hatred, but with a kind of weary, pitying contempt. He looked like a captured eagle forced to endure the foolish posturing of crows. The charges were read by a major who acted as the prosecutor. The words were a cascade of legalistic fiction inciting violence, sedition against the authority of the United States government, conspiracy, attempted murder of a federal soldier. Witnesses were called, soldiers who recounted the story of the scuffle by the creek, their testimony polished and rehearsed, painting the Lakota warrior as the clear aggressor and the wounded soldier as an innocent victim. The hayfire and the escape were described as a cunning, pre-planned attack. Not a word was said of the treaty, of the gold, of the years of broken promises that had led to this moment. Then, to the surprise of everyone, the prosecutor called his final witness, Evelyn Whitmore. A murmur went through the crowd of soldiers. Her father, who sat near the tribunal table, stiffened, his face going rigid. This was not part of his plan, but the prosecutor, a man eager to make a name for himself, saw a chance for a dramatic final stroke, to have the traitor's own daughter condemn him from the stand. Evelyn was led to the platform, her steps steady, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She did not look at her father. She looked at Black Eagle. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, and in them she saw not a plea for help, but a silent, steady strength that seemed to flow into her, fortifying her resolve. The prosecutor began his questioning, his voice dripping with a condescending sympathy meant to portray her as a weak, foolish woman who had been manipulated by a cunning savage. Miss Whitmore, is it not true that this man, the prisoner Black Eagle, held a strange influence over you, that he met with you in secret? Yes, Evelyn said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. We met in secret. And in these meetings, did he not speak of his hatred for the white man? Did he not try to turn you against your own father, against your country? In these meetings, she replied, her gaze leaving the prosecutor and sweeping across the faces of the three officers at the table. He spoke of the truth. It is a language I fear few of you here today are fluent in. The prosecutor's smile faltered. Confine your answers to the question, Miss Whitmore. He taught me that the treaty my father offered his people was a lie, she continued, her voice rising with a passion she could no longer contain. A lie designed to steal their sacred lands. He taught me of a letter, written by my father, that spoke not of peace, but of a conspiracy to take the gold from the Black Hills. Colonel Whitmore shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is unwell. She is hysterical, her mind poisoned by her ordeal. This testimony is irrelevant and slanderous. The presiding officer, a grim-faced colonel with a thick gray mustache, looked from the furious father to the strangely calm daughter. He conferred with his colleagues. For the sake of a complete record, he said finally, the objection is overruled. Let the witness speak, but be warned. Miss Whitmore, false testimony before a military tribunal is a serious offense. It is not as serious an offense as building a nation on a foundation of lies, she retorted. She turned her attention back to the assembled soldiers, to the entire world that was her witness. You accuse this man of inciting violence, but the greatest violence is the violence of a lie, the slow murder of a people's soul with false promises and stolen honor. You hold him in chains for wanting to protect his home, for refusing to sign a paper that would make his children beggars in their own land. You want to punish him for a fire, but you ignore the slow burning fire of injustice that you yourselves have set. She took a step forward, her eyes finding every man who refused to look at her, every officer who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You speak of justice. but you are afraid to look at what you are doing. You look at him and you see a savage, because it is easier than seeing a man whose dignity puts your own to shame. You look at this land and you see only what you can take from it, because it is easier than seeing a sacred place that you are desecrating. Justice is not found in a book of laws if the men who read it are blind. Justice begins when we dare to look. A profound, shocked silence followed her words. She had done it. She had spoken the truth, the whole, ugly, and unvarnished truth. She had detonated a bomb of honesty in the middle of their carefully constructed stage. She saw the flash of fury in her father's eyes, the dawning horror that he had lost control completely. But she also saw something else, a flicker of doubt in the eyes of a young lieutenant, a flush of shame on the face of a hardened sergeant. The truth, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The presiding officer banged his gavel on the table. "That is enough. The witness is excused. Her testimony is stricken from the record as the product of a disturbed and traitorous mind." As Evelyn was led away, her heart was not heavy with fear, but with a strange, clean lightness. She had lost everything, her family, her future, her freedom, but she had kept her soul. The verdict was swift. As expected, Chief Black Eagle was found guilty on all charges. The presiding officer stood to deliver the sentence, because of the prisoner's stature among his people, and as an act of supposed mercy by a benevolent government. The tribunal has decided against a sentence of death. Instead, you are to be stripped of your title and authority. You will be taken from this land and transported under guard to the military prison at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, Florida. There you will remain for the rest of your natural life. A gasp went through the Lakota observers. To send a man of the endless plains to a small, sun-blasted island in the middle of the sea was a cruelty more profound than a quick death. It was a sentence of slow suffocation, a living burial. Black Eagle did not flinch. He did not beg. He stood even taller, if that were possible. He looked not at the officers who had condemned him, but over their heads, toward the distant, hazy line of the Black Hills. He began to speak, not in the language of his captors, but in the low, resonant cadence of his own Lakota tongue. His words were not for the soldiers. They were for his people, for the land, for the spirits of his ancestors. It was not a plea, nor a curse. It was a statement of a truth more powerful and enduring than any military court. When he had finished, a deep and reverent silence held the prairie. The soldiers did not understand the words, but they understood their power. They felt the weight of a history they could not comprehend, the force of a spirit they could not break. As the guards moved to take him away, he turned his head and looked directly at Evelyn one last time. His eyes were not filled with sorrow, but with a message of profound and unbreakable gratitude. He had been seen. His truth had been spoken. A young officer, curious, turned to Samuel Crow, who had stood silently at the edge of the proceedings. "What did he say?" the officer asked. Samuel looked not at the officer, but at the vast, empty sky. He said, "Makakin lekea wikakte sni." He said, "The land remembers." The Chicago of 1888 was a city forged in noise and ambition. Its heartbeat was the relentless clang of steel on steel, the rumble of elevated trains on iron tracks, and the percussive symphony of a million boots on stone pavements. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys painted the sky a permanent, hazy gray, a stark contrast to the vast, clean blue that Evelyn remembered. The wind that blew off Lake Michigan was a different beast from the one that had scoured the Nebraska prairie. This wind was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of coal smoke, stockyards, and the cold, deep water of the lake. It was a world built of right angles and brute force, a world that had no time for the quiet, circular truths of the land she had left behind. 10 years had passed, 10 years since the mockery of a trial, since the last time she had seen Black Eagle's face. The colonel, her father, had kept his word. She had been quietly released from military custody at Fort Laramie and put on a stagecoach heading east with a small purse of money and a single, Final command, she was to never use the Whitmore name again. She was no longer his daughter. She was an unperson, a ghost, a shame to be forgotten. The break was absolute. She had read of his continued rise in the army in the newspapers, a career seemingly unblemished by the scandal she had tried to ignite. The world, it seemed, had a short memory for inconvenient truths. Evelyn, however, had a perfect one. The memory was the engine of her new life. She had arrived in Chicago a pariah, a woman without family, name, or prospects. But she had something more valuable, a purpose, forged in fire and tempered by loss. She found lodging in a boarding house and sought out the one thing she believed could be turned into a weapon, the law. She found a mentor in an aging, cantankerous lawyer named Arthur McCready, a man with a reputation for taking on impossible cases and a deep-seated loathing for government hypocrisy. He saw in the intense, quiet young woman a fire that reminded him of his own youth. He allowed her to read his books, to clerk in his dusty office, and eventually, he guided her through the labyrinthine process of becoming one of the city's first female lawyers. Her office was a small, second-floor room in a narrow building south of the river. It was a space as spare and functional as she had become. The walls were lined not with expensive paintings, but with maps of Western territories and reservations. The shelves were crammed with thick, somber volumes of federal law, Indian affairs reports, and transcripts of treaty negotiations. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint, ever-present scent of the city's industry. It was a world away from the prairie. Yet this small, cluttered room was the only place on earth she felt she was continuing the fight that had begun there. She was a strange and solitary figure in the city's legal circles. She did not attend social gatherings. She accepted no invitations. She lived a life of monastic devotion to her work. In the courts and government offices, she was known as a tenacious, unnervingly prepared, and deeply inconvenient presence. To the powerful men she challenged, she was a radical, an eccentric, a thorn in the side of progress. But to the delegations of native peoples who made the long, difficult journey east to seek her help, she was something else entirely. They called her by a name they had given her, a name that appeared on her legal correspondence, a quiet act of defiance and identity. On the documents she filed, she signed her name, Evelyn Ampetu Whitmore. Ampetu, they had told her, for the morning star, the first light that appears in the darkness. Her days were a war of attrition fought with paper and ink. She spent her hours poring over treaties, her finger tracing the convoluted language designed to deceive. She remembered explaining those same poisonous phrases to Black Eagle by the light of the moon, and the memory sharpened her focus, honed her anger into a fine, sharp point. She wrote letters, petitions, and legal briefs, her elegant penmanship now a tool to dismantle the very lies she had once been tasked to record. She fought for land rights, for promised annuities that never arrived, for protection against corrupt reservation agents who stole food from the mouths of children. Each small victory, a shipment of blankets released, a fraudulent land claim overturned, felt like a single, defiant heartbeat in a body that was supposed to be dead. She lived alone, in a small apartment above her office. But she was not lonely. The solitude was a space she filled with his memory. The world knew him as Black Eagle, the defeated Lakota chief, a name that was now a footnote in the official history of westward expansion. To her, he was the man who had taught her to listen to the earth, the man whose face held the sorrow and strength of a nation, the man whose touch had awakened her soul. His voice was a constant presence in the quiet moments of her life. When she read a government report that referred to his people as dependents or wards, she could hear his voice by the creek, low and resonant, speaking of a people who were not animals to be penned. When she looked out her window at the relentless, frantic energy of the city, she remembered his stillness, a calm that came from a deep, unshakable connection to the world. And in the deepest, most private chamber of her heart, she held on to the memory of the night in the cave. His whisper in the darkness was the creed by which she now lived her life. Look at me when I touch you. It had been a plea for honesty, for a connection that was real and unafraid. Now, it was her guiding principle. She applied it to everything. When she read a legal document, she looked past the words to the intent, to the human lives that were being touched and manipulated by the ink. When she interviewed a client, a displaced chief or a grieving mother, she looked at them, truly looked at them, until she saw not just their grievance, but their humanity, their dignity, their soul. She forced the courts and the bureaucrats to look, to see the faces behind the names on their dockets and reports. Justice begins when we dare to look, she had said at his trial, and she had built her life upon that single, unwavering truth. She never spoke of him to anyone. Her love for him was not a story to be shared. It had transcended romance and become the central, organizing principle of her existence. It was the fire that kept her warm in the cold, lonely city. It was the moral compass that guided her through the murky waters of the law. He had been taken from her, exiled to a prison of sun and salt water thousands of miles away, a place designed to break the spirit of a man born to the open plains. She had heard no news of him for years and assumed he was gone, his body buried in that foreign soil. But his spirit was not gone. It lived in her. It was in her hands as she wrote, in her voice as she argued, in the relentless, stubborn beating of her heart. One evening, as the gas lights began to hiss to life on the street below, she stood at her office window, looking out at the city, the noise, the smoke, the endless, striving ambition of it all. It was her father's world. It was the world that had condemned the man she loved. And here she was, in the very heart of it, using its own tools, its own language, to fight back. She had not forgotten. She could never forget. The love that had been born on the sun-scorched prairie had not died. It had transformed. It had become her life's work, a testament to the man who had taught her to see, and a promise to the land that remembered. The train was a creature of iron and steam, a loud and insistent beast that sliced a straight, determined line through a land of forgotten curves. From her window, Evelyn watched the country of her memory scroll by, a landscape tamed and transected by the very progress she had spent a lifetime fighting. The endless, open prairie of 1878 was gone, replaced by a neat patchwork of farms, each one a small kingdom ruled by barbed wire fences. Towns had sprouted where there had once been only buffalo grass and sky, their water towers and church steeples standing like stubborn monuments to the death of the wilderness. It was the autumn of 1928, and she was returning as an old woman to a place that existed now only in her heart. 50 years, a lifetime. The reflection that looked back at her from the dusty window glass was that of a stranger. The face was a fine, pale parchment, etched with the intricate map of a long and difficult life. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, was now a cloud of pure white, pinned neatly in the old style that had long since gone out of fashion. Only her eyes were the same, a clear, steady gray that had witnessed too much to ever look away. Her work was done. The small, cluttered office in Chicago was closed, the books and maps given away to a new generation of young, idealistic lawyers who would carry on the fight. She had won some battles and lost many more, but she had fulfilled her silent vow. She had used the white man's law to carve out small spaces of justice for the people of the man she had loved. She had given her entire life to honoring his memory, to being a witness for a truth the world was determined to forget. Now, there was one last journey to make, a final pilgrimage to the place where her life had truly begun. She disembarked at a small, sleepy station in Nebraska. The town was a quiet affair of brick buildings and dusty streets, a place that had settled into the landscape with a comfortable permanence. No one paid any mind to the old woman in the simple dark dress, her back straight, her movements slow but deliberate. She carried only a small traveling case and a long, carefully wrapped bundle. She hired a man with an automobile, a noisy, rattling machine that felt even more alien here than the train. to take her as close as he could to the place she described from memory, a certain bend in a creek, marked by a stand of ancient cottonwoods. The driver, a young man with a friendly, open face, looked at her with polite curiosity but asked no questions. The car took her as far as the roads went, and then she paid him and began to walk. The air was different here. It was the same wind, but it carried different scents. It smelled of tilled earth and cut hay, the smells of a domesticated land. But underneath, if she closed her eyes and truly listened with the senses Black Eagle had taught her to use, she could still smell it, the dry, sweet perfume of the prairie grass, the clean scent of dust, the immense, open smell of the sky itself. Her steps were slow, but her heart was light. It felt not like a return, but like a completion. She found the stand of cottonwoods, their leaves a brilliant, trembling gold in the late afternoon sun. They were larger now, their bark more deeply furrowed. But they were the same trees, and beyond them, the creek still whispered its endless, secret story over the same smooth stones. She stood on the bank, in the exact spot where she had stood all those years ago, a frightened, defiant girl on the cusp of a decision that would define her. The world was quieter now. The army camp was gone, its neat, angry lines long since erased by time and grass. The Lakota camp, with its circles of life and the steady, nightly beat of its drum, was also gone, a ghost of a memory on the wind. There was only the land, the sky, and the water, the eternal witnesses. She unwrapped the bundle she carried. It was a long, thick braid of sweetgrass, now dry and fragrant with the scent of decades. It had been a gift, sent to her years ago by the family of a Lakota man she had helped defend, a symbol of gratitude and recognition. They had told her it was a woman's braid, meant to be burned to purify a space and carry prayers to the Creator. To her, it had always been a tangible link to him, a scent that could, in the lonely quiet of her Chicago nights, momentarily transport her back to the wild, clean world he had shown her. She held the braid in her wrinkled hands, its texture rough and familiar. She closed her eyes. The 50 years between then and now collapsed into a single, breathless moment. She was no longer an old woman at the end of her life. She was 25 again, standing in the moonlight, her heart hammering in her chest as he spoke to her across the water. She could feel the chill of the night air, hear the thrum of the distant drum. She could feel the shocking, gentle warmth of his hand on her cheek, the rough texture of his skin, the intensity of his gaze that saw not what she was, but who she was. Look at me when I touch you. A sound, high and piercing, cut through her reverie. She opened her eyes and looked up. A great eagle was circling high above, a dark, solitary shape against the vast, pale canvas of the sky. It rode the currents of the wind with an effortless grace, its wild freedom a thing of breathtaking beauty. It let out another long, lonely cry, a sound that was both a lament and a declaration. A peace that was deeper than any she had ever known settled over her. Her long fight was over. The world had changed, and the people she fought for were still fighting, and would continue to fight, but her part was done. Her promise had been kept. She had been a witness. She had not looked away. The eagle gave one last cry and then soared away, disappearing into the endless blue. Evelyn smiled, a faint, slow smile of release. She looked out across the golden plains, at the horizon that stretched on forever. The sun was low, painting the clouds in shades of rose and lavender. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking, and eternal land. It remembered. She brought the sweetgrass braid to her face, inhaling its sacred scent one last time. She whispered the words into the wind, a final testament meant only for the sky and the land and the spirit of the man who had taught her how to see.
I saw you, Black Eagle, truly saw you, and that was enough.
A gentle breeze stirred, rustling the golden leaves of the cottonwoods. It moved across the prairie, carrying with it the fragrant scent of sweetgrass and the clean, promising smell of rain on the horizon. Somewhere in the endless sky, the land remembered. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know where in the world you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.